Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Wendy Cutler. I'm Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I'm really pleased you could join us today for an event on U.S. Japan relations. When we scheduled this event, we did not know about Prime Minister Ishiba's visit to Washington on Friday, but if you want to give us credit for that, we will accept it. And I would just really like to thank the Japanese Embassy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for all of their support, not only for this event, but for the women's program that I'll explain in a minute, which brings us to this event today. And I'm so thrilled that Minister Nomura from the embassy could join us, so thank you very much. And I'm also pleased to be joined by three excellent panelists. If I need to learn anything about Japan, this is the go-to team. And so thank you. I'm going to introduce you each in a couple of minutes. But before I get to the topic, I do want to just highlight that this event is part of a three-day kind of an initiative that we are implementing to bring young Japanese professional women to the United States and to, through briefings, through negotiating workshops, to bring them to share with them our views and insights on different economic issues on our agenda, but also to give them hands-on experience in negotiations. This year, we're delighted to welcome 10 Japanese women to the United States. 4 of them are from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 6 of them are from the private sector, and I think, if I'm correct, except for the women in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they all knew each other, but the other women did not know each other, and today we were joined by 10 American women as well. And so part of this initiative is really about networking and building networks among the participants. If I can just ask, and I know it's maybe a little embarrassing, but I would ask the women who joined us to please stand up and show yourselves to the crowd, and then during the reception, please try and spend some time with them. So again, thank you very much for joining us. Needless to say, we find ourselves at an important juncture in U.S.-Japan relations today, and we couldn't have a better panel to help us kind of sort through the issues on the agenda, both the challenges but also the opportunities. And with that, allow me to introduce our 3 panelists. First, Mireya Solís, who is Director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. She is an expert on Japanese foreign economic policy, international trade policy, U.S. economic statecraft, and has recently written a book including the latest one entitled Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. I would say a must-read for anyone who really cares and really wants to understand the evolution of our important bilateral relationship. David Boling is the Director of Japan and Asia Trade at the Eurasia Group, but more importantly, he used to be my colleague at USTR, and once I left, he continued to stay there and worked on the U.S.-Japan trade agreement as well as on the digital agreement. And last but not least is Emma Chanlett-Avery. She is my colleague at the Asia Society Policy Institute, the Director for Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of our office. And before joining us, she spent many years at the Congressional Research Service. So we're going to start the conversation. I'll ask some questions, but then I'm going to turn to all of you. So start thinking of questions that you may want to pose as well. So with that, let me turn to our panelists. And I guess the first question I would ask out of the box is, how would you assess the U.S.-Japan relationship today? And if you had to list some of the strong points in the relationship, but also some of the challenges, I think that would be useful for the audience. So Mireya, maybe I can turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. And Just taking stock of where we are in the U.S.-Japan relationship, two words that come to mind is it's a strong, robust relationship, but also a nimble one. And I would like to emphasize that over the past dozen years, I think that we have witnessed a really profound process of transformation of the U.S.-Japan relationship. I think that at this moment, there's been a strong strategic convergence when you in Washington and Tokyo, where you look at the security landscape. I see a lot of alignment in identifying some of the key challenges at in the current moment that we are living, but also an enlargement and expansion of the areas in which the allies are cooperating. So, a topic that we follow very closely, economic security, has now emerged as a key area where the United States and Japan are cooperating closely. But also when we think about a broader regional diplomacy, if you look at the series of unilaterals that the Biden administration put an effort in developing, the one partner that was a constant presence is Japan. So when you think about diplomacy, when you think about strategic alignment, when you think about expanding the agenda, I think this has been all very positive news. Now, I also would say that it is also true, and let's be candid, that Japan and the United States have agreed to disagree when it comes to the merits of trade liberalization. That's not one area where the two countries are.
I don't even know we're allowed to use those words anymore, trade liberalization.
To my point. But nevertheless, the bilateral economic relationship is very strong. Japanese companies are very large investors here in the United States. So even then, when there has been some gap, I think it has been managed well. If I were to offer some hypothesis as to how we explain this process of deepening of the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think that two main factors, obviously a lot has been happening, but two that I would call your attention to is, first of all, I think we have to look at what has happened inside Japan and how Japan has become a more proactive actor in the international stage. And I think that this paved the way for Japan to cooperate in many ways that it was not prepared to do so in the past. But also I believe that as the United States has identified China as a key peer competitor, and as the United States has identified the Indo-Pacific as a critical area, I think that it has also come to appreciate that a strong partnership with Japan is essential for the United States to achieve its objectives. Now, this is all very good, but I think that this process of expansion, of deepening of the U.S.-Japan partnership is not foreordained. And I think that 2 weeks into the Trump administration, it's a good moment to stop and ask, well, what are some of the bumps ahead? What are some of the areas that we should be paying attention to? And I think that the Trump administration, if you look at some of the appointments, I think that there's a lot of skepticism of China when you look at the positions for foreign policy and national security, and I think there's a lot of appreciation for the need to work with partners. So that would hint on some level of continuity that may be helpful for the next stage of the U.S.-Japan relationship. But we should also not forget that the commander-in-chief, the president, is not ideological, is not a hawk when it comes to China, and he may actually want to seek some space for negotiation. Interestingly, he has already moved to implement that 10% tariff, but nevertheless, that disconnect between what the team might be thinking and what the president may be doing is something that we have to be watching for. And other bumps with the fact that President Trump is a strong believer on tariffs and takes a transactional approach to alliances. But I would argue that there are new elements that I think will create a more complex set of issues for the U.S.-Japan alliance, and I'll end up just by flagging them for all of you. One is that I think that we're talking about the use of tariffs in a way that we hadn't really completely developed in the first Trump administration, and that is, in the terms of issuing tariff ultimatums to press for concessions on non-trade, non-economic issues. And we saw that with Colombia, we saw that with Mexico and Canada. So, I've been hearing from some folks visiting from Tokyo for the first time using the terms U.S. economic coercion. We used to think that economic coercion was just when we were talking about China. Now this, I think, has entered the bloodstream. We're discussing whether this could be serious. And finally, just to be a little provocative, I think that what may be challenging is not just what the Trump administration does in the Indo-Pacific, but what it's choosing to do first in the Western Hemisphere. That to me was a big surprise. And I think that to the extent that this administration is sending signals about territorial expansion or using pressure to acquire some territorial concessions, I think that also opens a new kind of warmth for many of our partners elsewhere. So I'll stop here.
So could I just follow up,
Yeah.
on one point you made, and that is you pointed to the active role of Japan on the international stage. Was this unique to Prime Minister Abe, and does Prime Minister Ishiba, who has a lot of focus on domestic politics and the economy and all of that, is this something that is continuing as robustly?
I wouldn't say it's unique to Prime Minister Abe. I think that indeed the fact that you had a very strong political figure who managed to stay for 8 years in office, who had a strong prime ministerial office, being able to put the ministries, align them, make them work closely, and also confront some of the vested political interests, that helped a lot. I think it also helped that he had this vision about the Indo-Pacific, open and free Indo-Pacific, and the vision therefore was very, very helpful. But some of the initiatives that he was building on, some other administrations had already begun to make the groundwork. And even after Prime Minister Abe stepped down and later was tragically assassinated, his successors, Prime Minister Suga and Prime Minister Kishida, very much continued with that. And actually, Prime Minister Kishida in particular, I would say, expanded this with taking a very proactive stance when it comes to the Ukraine war. When it comes to Prime Minister Ishiba, my sense is that in the beginning there have been some questions as to whether he would have a different approach on foreign policy, some ideas that he discussed about an Asian NATO, for example. But my sense is that relatively quickly we began to hear more about the more conventional frames that that Tokyo has been using about foreign policy. But there's one difference here, and that is the fact that Prime Minister Ishiba presides over a minority government, and therefore the challenges of getting bills passed, the challenges of negotiating the budget, all that I think looms larger when it comes to the Ishiba administration. So for that reason, I think he might be a little bit more focused on what's happening domestically, simply because the political constraints are tighter today.
All right, David, over to you. Do you share Mireya's kind of optimistic assessment of our robust relationship between Tokyo and Washington? And if you had to identify some potential bumps going forward, what's top of mind for you?
Well, first of all, thank you, Wendy. It's great to be up here with you and Emma and Mireya. Before I make my remarks, I just wanted to share one story about Wendy. From my time working with her. I'll be quick. But I really want to applaud Wendy because she's been such a leader of bringing women into international trade. But when I worked with her at USTR, Wendy is a high energy person. And she would send emails from time to time. And once she sent me an email and I was reading it and it was about Lotus. And I was like, what is Wendy writing to me about Lotus? And then I looked at the keyboard where you type. And I noticed that the L is next to K and the R is next to T. And so I deciphered, you're really emailing me about Chorus, the Korea-U.S. trade agreement, of which she negotiated. So Wendy's so high energy, sometimes her typing skills suffer, I noticed. But that's my Wendy story, of which there are many throughout Washington, D.C. But to your question, yes, I do agree with Mireya that when you look at the U.S. Japan relation right now, I think it's fair to say it's as strong as ever. And I do think that former Prime Minister Abe gets a lot of that credit, Suga, as well as Kishida, really, and President Biden, and how they worked so well together on national security issues, which Emma is going to talk about. But also in the trade arena, of course, we have had some differences with them, but the relationship is remarkably strong, and the Trump administration is inheriting that, and they certainly ought to appreciate it. I think Japan's clout in Washington, D.C. is higher than it's been in years. And the reason I say that is because I feel like in Washington, D.C., there's a recognition that Japan is really important for the United States when it comes to having an effective China strategy, that Japan really is indispensable, that we have to have Japan with us if we want to have an effective China strategy, whether it be on economic strategy or national security. So I think that has increased Japan's clout in Washington, D.C. and influence, and I've been happy to see that. I would say that we've learned some lessons from the first Trump administration, and one is that in dealing with Trump, the way I think about it is, for most presidents, foreign policy is a top goal, and then trade policy is like a subset of that. Not with Trump, right? Trade policy is above or equal to foreign policy, and it shapes the way he views the world. And it's going to shape how he interacts with Japan. Again, in the second administration, we see it already playing out, in this last week with Canada, Mexico, and China. So that's one lesson that's important to remember. I think Japan has probably dropped down the list on the trade priority list for the Trump administration. That's because we negotiated the U.S. Japan trade agreement. And that dealt with a lot of the main issues between the U.S. and Japan, which was agriculture market access. Japan, though, still has a substantial trade surplus, and we know there's one thing that Trump really hates, and that's U.S. trade deficits. So that keeps Japan on the trade target list. As I say, it's not as high as China, Vietnam, Mexico, but it's on the list, and there will be some heat at some point, I would predict, on Japan. And then lastly, I would say, of course, Abe's not here with us, and so all the question and all the focus now is on how Ishiba will be able to do, and whether he will be able to have a positive relationship with Trump. They seem like very different people. So I wonder if they're going to have the personal chemistry that, and I really don't expect them, frankly, to have the personal chemistry that Abe and Trump have. But I do think that Ishiba, desperately needs to have a positive relationship with Trump for his own political standing back home. The frictions, I would say, and then I'll turn it over to Emma, are probably going to be automobiles again, because so much of that makes up the trade deficit. And I do think that Nippon Steel is obviously an area where the United States and Japan have some current frictions. So I'll stop there.
So Emma, over to you. You've heard two assessments of the U.S.-Japan relationship. How do you view our ties right now? Are they as strong as ever?
Thanks, Wendy. And I'll tell you, David, that Wendy remains a high-energy person as her deputy.
And she still doesn't know how to type.
Yeah, all of us know how to decipher the keyboard to know what Wendy's really trying to say. That's a constant. So I'm the token security person here, which means I probably can be a little bit less, I think, optimistic on this front. Yes, I think that the U.S.-Japan relationship is very strong, but it's also very much beset by uncertainty right now. A couple weeks ago, ASPE had a conference in New York City called the U.S.-Japan relationship at a pivotal moment, and I think that's really true right now. We know that under the Trump administration, it's going to diverge from the Biden approach. The Biden approach was very much building up all of these mini-laterals, U.S.-Japan Philippines, U.S.-Japan South Korea, the Quad, a number of others, and all of those had the U.S.-Japan alliance very much at its center as sort of the anchoring presence. And in addition, bilaterally, the U.S. and Japan were working very hard on modernizing their own alliance. So I think that set a very strong foundation, but I think that obviously Trump is going to take a different approach. And we can talk about the different pathways in which Trump might go and the implications for Japan and the U.S.-Japan alliance. But I'll just say right now that I think there are some fundamentals that are going to be in place no matter which direction Trump chooses to go on China. One of those is the tension that I think Tokyo feels between wanting the United States to be tough on China, but also wanting to stabilize the relationship with Beijing. There's a lot going on between Japan and China right now that looks like they're trying to reach out to each other. And if there's a very aggressive approach from Washington, then that causes some troubles for Japan living in China's backyard, essentially. I think that burden sharing issues no matter how the relationship is going, are going to be very difficult. The burden sharing, host nation support, special measures agreement comes up for renegotiation now. Essentially, it expires, I think, early next year, and that could very much be a target for the Trump administration. We know from the first term of Trump that he demanded steep increases in contributions to hosting U.S. troops in Korea, and will probably do so for Japan. So I think that could be a difficult moment, and it comes up pretty early in Trump's term. I also think that extended deterrence is going to get harder and harder. That reassurance is just now that North Korea has far more capabilities, has much more of a credible threat to strike the U.S. homeland, the U.S. withdrawal from leadership in some fora, including the economic. It just is harder and harder to convince Japan and our other allies there that we are going to be there up to and including nuclear weapons to defend them. And then the last thing I'm going to say is that we've seen the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration play out. There could definitely be a hollowing out of the bureaucracies, and alliances are very much maintained at the working level. Those are the people who know the relationship, that reach out, that know their counterparts, that know where all the bodies are buried, so to speak. And if we see a departure of that working level staff, I think that we can see the alliance suffer to some extent. It's not sexy work that you do in terms of maintaining the day-to-day relationship, but it's essential to maintain that trust. So that might be a little bit more of a negative view, but that's what security people do.
So let's then get to the actual Ishiba Trump meeting on Friday. And I'm going to ask each of you, if you were on the plane with the Japanese delegation and the prime minister, and he called you in to brief him, and you basically just had a couple of minutes, what would be the do's and the don'ts? What should he emphasize, and what should he avoid? Who wants to go first? David, you're going to go first because Mireya looks like she's thinking.
So, again, I would tell him it's very important for you to be yourself and to recognize, yes, that Abe set this standard out there, and a lot of people will probably judge you by that standard, but that it's very important for you to be genuine and not try to necessarily replicate what Abe did. You're a different person, but you need to have a constructive relationship with the President of the United States, because the Japanese expect you to. They expect you to be able to get along with whoever it is in the White House because the relationship is so important to them. And that you need a good meeting for your political standing back home. Because, as Mireya said, he's leading a minority government, and his approval ratings are not very high. His average approval rating, from looking at the January poll numbers, is about in the mid-30s. So he needs a win. So that's one thing I would say. The other is that, yeah, his goals should be to, deflect any tariff threats, but to engage with Trump and show where Japan could be helpful, like on the trade deficit, where it can perhaps buy more LNG, buy more defense equipment. He needs to be able to be positive with him, and to be positive to the extent he can on issues related to national security, increasing the defense budget, showing that Japan's moving on that trajectory, increasing direct investment in the United States, to hit those key points, because those are points that are important to Trump.
Mireya?
I agree with everything David said. Maybe what I could contribute to this conversation is, if I was sitting in that airplane, what I would be thinking, and I'm not sure I would share with my boss. And what I have in mind is that, first of all, I think that it's almost like mission impossible for Prime Minister Ishiba, because the comparisons to Prime Minister Abe are going to be the first yardstick that everybody uses to see whether it was successful or not. And that's a very unfair and impossible comparison to make, because you cannot, manufacture chemistry. You never know what happens when the people meet in a room, but also because we are in a completely different moment. I think that President Trump in 2016 was very receptive to, the visit from Abe. He felt that showed great respect to him, and he was also very open, I think, to receive input from Prime Minister Abe. Now he's been president, and he probably thinks that he doesn't need advice from foreign leaders to understand the region. So I think that that comparison always to how Prime Minister Abe dealt with him is going to be to his disadvantage. But the other thing that I think is really important is that he's coming this week and he's going to be competing for media attention because we're in the middle of a deluge of activities from the Trump administration that we don't even know where to look. And I know
There's
that
breaking news every 30 minutes.
Every hour, and so I know that obviously the press in Japan is going to be, focused like a hawk on what happens, what's said, and so forth. But here in Washington, I think that visit is going to be competing with a slew of other developments. Netanyahu was just now here, and what happens to the federal government. Public officials don't know if they should take the buyout offer, the Treasury Department payment system. I mean, we never had a transition like this. So I think that we might not be paying enough attention to the Prime Minister visit. And lastly, I think it would be very important, what I would perhaps recommend, I don't know if I can tell it to my boss, is that we try to set realistic expectations. This is going to be the first interaction they have. I would not imagine, I think that the Biden administration statements every time you had a leader meeting was perhaps too long. I'm in this business and even I had a hard time reading through everything. But this might not be that kind of a statement. And I think it's just important that they get off on good terms without necessarily having the expectation that they'll be as close as Abe and Trump were in the past, but that I think that Prime Minister Ishiba would like to come here and get confirmation that the essentials of the U.S. Japan alliance are in place. And I think that would be the realistic goal that I would suggest that he tries to get from these meetings.
Emma, do you think that the Prime Minister should be proactive in, offering a shopping list or announcing new investments or talking about what he's prepared to do with respect to, the security issues? Or should he be more in listening mode and find out what's important to Trump during that meeting and then respond?
I think it's going to be actually a very straightforward meeting on these issues. Ishiba is looking to, say to the United States, we're a reliable ally, we're at your side. They're going to look for a reaffirmation of Article 5 of the U.S. Japan Security Treaty, which involves the Senkakus, which I assume that they will get because I think this is a cut and paste thing from previous statements. And yes, I think they need to have probably not a lot of new security initiatives. They'll probably offer all these investments, emphasize that they are, committed to spending up to 2% of their GDP on their defense. I think he'll get those in, but I think it'll be pretty straightforward. This meeting is not going to cause a lot of news. Of course, we all talk about him needing to establish this similar rapport that Abe had with him, but I will just say that I'm not sure that matters that much. Much is made of this, so I'm being a little bit of a contrarian here. But although Abe had maybe the best relationship with Trump compared to other foreign leaders, he still wasn't spared from the tariffs. He didn't get a lot of emphasis put on the abductees when Trump met with Kim Jong-un. So I think that we make a little bit too much about that relationship because I don't think he ultimately got that many concessions from Trump.
David, quick question for you, because I know you've written about this. Do you think the Prime Minister should raise the Nippon Steel issue?
That's a tricky one. But I have been struck by how, in my view, Ishiba has played Nippon Steel differently from Kishida. And when the deal was first announced, it wasn't long after that Kishida was in town to meet with Biden. And he made it quite clear he was not going to raise the issue, that he didn't want that to be a cloud over all the security cooperation that was occurring. And I thought that was a wise move at the time. The Ishiba has been, in my view, more outspoken about it and more willing to question the decision. And he may feel like he needs to do that politically, right, for his own domestic political audience, that Japan is an ally, and to block the deal for national security reasons just doesn't make sense to Japan. But it's very tricky because, look, we know what President Trump has said about the deal, that he opposes it. I mean, it was not only President Trump that opposed the deal, it was President Biden, it was Vice President Vance, it was, Vice President Kamala Harris, all of them. So this was just a political hot potato from the very beginning. And I think that if it comes up that Ishiba needs to be a bit careful about pressing hard, I think the Nippon Steel and the Japanese government are hoping that Trump will make an about face, right, and approve the deal, maybe like TikTok. I think that's very much a gamble. But I do think that he needs to be ready for it because the press is going to focus a lot on this, because the press is always looking for friction points. And that this would be, I expect, one of the first questions at their press conference is whether this was discussed and what does the president think about it? Is he going to change his mind? What does Ishiba think about it? So he needs to be ready for that one.
Mireya, over to you on a tariff question. Not only, as a large deficit country, is Japan probably worried about tariff increases against Japanese imports, but I'm sure over the past week, once these tariffs were announced on Mexico, many Japanese automakers and other companies were extremely concerned and may be pressuring the prime minister to kind of raise the issue with Trump so he understands this just doesn't hurt just Mexico. This could really hurt, Japanese companies as well. Is this something he raises?
Well, I don't know exactly how much he can press on all these issues at the first meeting, but certainly this is something that will be in the mind of the Prime Minister and of Japanese companies, because as we know, we operate in a world of supply chains, and Japanese companies have long-term investments in both Canada and Mexico, and we know
was
that
Mexico like their first FTA? Or
one of the
first?
yes,
Yeah.
I believe so. Well, Singapore and then Mexico.
Okay.
Yeah, and I actually happened to, anyway, a long time ago
Okay.
I was involved in that. But yeah, I mean, is that how he starts? I'm not sure, because Mexico and Canada right now are triggering Trump in ways that you may not have a very productive discussion, and if that comes on the heels of Nippon Steel, it might be too much. But I do think that they're watching very closely. I think that everybody understands that for Japan, it's not just whether the bilateral tariffs are applied or not. That would be certainly something that would have very serious consequences. But it's also what happens in the North American trade agreement. It's also what happens with the U.S.-China trade war. I mean, we know that Japanese companies have been affected every time there's an uptick on tariffs. The question I have, and if I could turn it to you or to others, is would Tokyo respond differently this time, or will it choose to negotiate and try to bring down the temperature if tariffs were applied to Japan directly? Because I think it's very interesting to watch, for example, how the Canadians, the Mexicans, the Europeans, very similar to the playbook of 2018, they all have prepared their list. They all have announced a signal that they would retaliate, but you don't find that in the case of Japan. And that may be the wiser approach, but I would also point to you that the Trump administration officials seem to be very focused on the question as to whether there is retaliation or not, because they are implementing these broader set of tariffs, and Trump almost like willy-nilly use of them at a time when we know that inflation has had major consequences here in the United States, political consequences as well. And if you look at some of the confirmation testimony, say from Mr. Besant, he makes the point that the tariffs are not going to hurt the American consumer because the U.S. will be able to change the terms of trade, and it will be the exporters who pay. But if there's retaliation, we know that that leaves both producers and consumers here in the United States worse off. So I think that's why you see, this thing when Trump announces in the executive order, tariffs will go up against Mexico and Canada, and if we retaliate, they'll go up again. Yeah. Is precisely to try to damp on that a possibility of retaliation. As a trade scholar, I'm very torn about this. I don't want to move to world tit for tat trade tariffs, but I also understand that if there's no cost imposed, then what's the limit? So I think that, my question, and I've asked and asked in Tokyo, nobody would give me a straight answer, is there a moment when you rethink your approach to signal absolutely no retaliation despite what may come your way?
Because during the first term also,
There was-
on steel and aluminum tariffs, Japan did not counter-retaliate, correct?
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Okay, let's open the floor to any questions. It's a little hard to see you all. Someone has a microphone I think they can bring around. So who would like to pose a question to the panel? Yes, the gentleman in the back. And just, if you can identify yourself and just one question per person.
Hi, Wendy. This is Ed Bristois from the Consumer Technology Association. Thank you for the panel discussion. What I'd like to understand is where Japan and the United States can cooperate, specifically on the basis of what's in the America First trade policy memorandum. It seemed to me anyway, reading that there could be some areas of cooperation, like on sectoral agreements, but love to hear thoughts from Mireya and David, and, in particular.
So in the president's trade executive order, he lays out a number of reviews and studies to be undertaken by a number of different agencies. One of them I think Ed referred to is that that there is mention of identifying free trade agreements or sectoral agreements that might be of interest. Is this potentially an area where the U.S. and Japan can cooperate? And are there other areas in that executive order, other studies or reports that could also emphasize U.S.-Japan cooperation?
Well, my first thought is that the areas where I think it would be easier to cooperate would be related to economic security, where there's a shared threat perception, so protection of technology, supplies, reliable supply of critical minerals, things of this nature. I'm not sure that when the Trump administration was thinking of new trade agreements, where they were necessarily thinking about Japan. As David mentioned, there's already a stage one U.S.-Japan trade agreement and a digital trade agreement. I'm not sure what they would be.
And a critical minerals agreement.
That's very much in the, that doesn't have a lot of binding force, but nevertheless. So I think those are the areas that I think there might be something there. But I think to do that, you would require the ability to compartmentalize and deal with perhaps friction on, tariffs, dealing with the cost of Trump applying tariffs on important trading partners that have consequences for Japanese companies, and nevertheless that not creeping on the way of having distrust to negotiate on the economic security front. So I think that's one of the challenges that that America First trade policy poses for Japan, that they are now going in very, very different directions. One thing is not to agree on the merits of free trade agreements. The other one is when you're concerned that the United States is using tariffs as a tool of coercive diplomacy in a very rampant way. And I think that whether you are the targeter of that directly or whether that compromises or puts your companies at risk might also be a source of friction going forward. So I imagine there'll be plenty of discussions about how we can find a positive economic agenda. But I do think that Japan, being a country that has a trade surplus vis-a-vis the United States, also puts it in the spotlight in terms of how Trump measures the value of these economic relationships.
David, any?
That's a very hard question. I hadn't thought, when I looked at the memorandum, I was thinking more, okay, this one Japan needs to be concerned about, this one Japan needs to be concerned about, this one Japan needs to be concerned about. So it's a tough question. I would say at a sort of high level that the problems that Japan has with China when it comes to trade are largely the same as the problems that United States has, right? Whether it be heavy subsidization of steel and solar panels and now electric vehicles, or the theft of intellectual property forced technology transfer, all those issues. So when I was at USTR, I was struck by how much cooperation was going on between Japan and the United States, because I had this very strong sense that because we have so many shared values, we were looking at the problem of China through the same lens. So I think at that sort of high level, there's a lot of opportunity for U.S.-Japan cooperation. But looking at that memo specifically, there's some things that Japan needs to be concerned about. For example, my memory is that the paragraph that talks about trade deficits also talks about the supplemental universal tariff, or whatever the language they used, and linking those. And so that has to be a concern for Japan for sure. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
Yes, I'm Tom Reckford. Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. I wonder if all of you could discuss the area of military cooperation, which has obviously increased a lot in recent years. And do you expect the Trump administration to put pressure on Japan to spend a lot of money to help support U.S. forces in Japan? And will there be pressure to increase the defense budget, just as there are pressures for our European allies to increase their defense budgets?
Emma, over to you on that one.
Yes and yes will be my answers. I think absolutely that we know actually from former National Security Advisor John Bolton's memoir that the administration, the Trump administration, intended to ask for I think $8 billion a year, and now it's somewhere around $2 billion a year to offset the cost of hosting U.S. forces there. So I assume that a similar formulation is in mind, and as I mentioned, the agreement that has been in place for the last 5 years is about to expire. So I think that it's going to expire, in a midterm election year. I just see it as a target. Now, Japan does get to say that they have increased their defense budget considerably, doubling it over 5 years, up to 2% of GDP. So they do have that. I think that they'll say 3%, 4%, 5%. I think that will be the demand signal from them. But they can point to, they're getting up to the level that NATO members spend if they do indeed increase to around 2%. But I expect that that they'll go in with a very, very high number and make it to a deal. The question is, how much pain will Japan endure? How much cost can it absorb?
Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much for today's session. My name is Yukari Sekiguchi from Albright Stonebridge Group. So my question is, probably since November or December, we have studied and then learned a lot about IPA, Section 232 or Section 301, already happened. So my question, probably Wendy, I know you are today's moderator, and then David, but as a former USTR, could you provide us with other trade measures Trump may pursue next? That is my question.
I mean, other actions
Other
that could
trade measures Trump may
Could-
pursue.
could take
Mm-hmm.
under existing U.S. trade laws.
U.S. trade law.
Okay, well, maybe
Well, go ahead.
I'm the moderator, for the record.
Well, I mean, I think you've hit the big ones, right? I think Section 232 definitely back out there. I think Japan should be prepared for steel, potentially for steel tariffs again, right? Those were put on in the first Trump
Yeah,
administration.
the president has mentioned 5 sectors that he plans to raise tariffs on, right? Semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, steel, aluminum, and copper.
Yeah.
So would those be subject maybe to 232
I
investigations?
think so. I'd put automobiles on there too, frankly. So 232, we see that he's using IPA, as you said, and using it in a very creative way. And I think many of us thought that that was certainly on the table, and in particular right now, likely to be used because, I mean, this memorandum that we're talking about, the president's waiting for, input from Commerce Department, from USTR.
Is he really waiting? Because he's certainly announcing a lot without the
Well,
reports.
It's a fair question, but the way I look at it is that's when the real fireworks are going to start, right? I mean, this is just sort of the prelude, and it's zigging and zagging and all that, but he's going to have his trade people in place by then. They'll be advising him, and at that point, you have like sort of the basis set to move forward. And to me, that's when the real show begins. But Section 301, obviously, that's going to be up again. So I think you've hit the big ones. I don't know if I missed anything, Mireya or Wendy.
No, I think you have them. I'll just share a thought. When the inauguration speech was released, I think that there was a discussion among Washington trade experts as to whether this has been a surprise or not, because many folks thought that he was coming out and immediately applying tariffs. And, I've had some of colleagues say, well, he just, it's not going to be as bad as we expected, because he just ordered a bunch of studies of things that actually we have already studied, and that's when you're going to be doing the review of 301, 232, and all these other ways in which he could get at tariffs and so forth. But I actually feel that, that afternoon we already knew that he was not going to wait, that he doesn't need the studies, that he's going to use tariffs in very, very new ways, in the sense of giving very short timelines. Really, it feels like an ultimatum. You accept the planes where we're sending the immigrants back, or the tariff goes up. With Mexico and Canada, these very fuzzy metrics as to what would secure the border when it comes to fentanyl or immigration, and giving them 2, 3, 4, 5 days before they change anything. And then he did call on AIPA. And what we're seeing with AIPA is that, it gives the executive really tremendous discretion as to when he's going to invoke the tariff. So the studies may be forthcoming, but he's already moving forward. And the question is, what is he trying to achieve? Is this done mostly to negotiate? Is it done mostly to punish countries for things that he believes have been done that are wrong to the United States? And what is he getting out of it? Because you could make the case, I think, that he's prepared to settle so far, and we're only 2 weeks in, so I may be completely wrong, and this is the nature of the Trump administration, but I think that in some ways he's settling for symbolic wins. When you look at what Canada put on the table, a border plan that Canada had already prepared in December. Mexico has already in the past deployed troops to the border to help control immigration flows. The Colombian president, he's sent his own airplane. So you can, their narrative's been built as to who's caving in and what is he actually achieving. But I would say that nevertheless, the uncertainty, the chaos, the fear that the United States is going to use economic might in an erratic fashion, there are real consequences to that. And I think that that's something that we'll see play out as we go forward.
And it's interesting because both with respect to Canada and Mexico, that undertook a number of measures to alleviate his concern. Now, whether they were already in place, right? They're only given a month. We're going to be back in this world in 29 days in terms of what happens then. Or does he just forget about it and moves on to, other countries? So we'll see. We're going to wind this up, but I thought we could just do a quick round robin, and that is, if you were part of Ishiba's delegation, now you're on the plane going home, what's the newspaper headline you want to see coming out of this summit? And what don't you want to see? Emma?
I think that you'd like to see something fairly anodyne, like Trump reconfirms importance of U.S. Japan alliance. Something that is not outrageous, nothing, no crazy outbursts or offhand comments. I think you want to see it like it's just a normal heads of state summit. Because I think that Ishiba not only is he on somewhat weak ground politically, and he needs to show that he can secure these kind of commitments, he also needs to sell to the Japanese public the need for these investments that they have proposed. So I think that would be the first step to making that campaign.
I agree with Emma. The best headline would be U.S. Japan alliance affirmed, rock solid, something like that. A bad headline would be Japan gets whacked with tariffs. Or
Japan is 1 week, 3 days, according to
right.
Mireya.
Or big feud over Nippon Steel would be bad. So I think he want that sort of off the top of my head. Those are the ones that come to mind.
I agree. The last thing I would like to see on the plane back is Trump made these threats of Japan. You have certain time to comply, trade deficit, or spending more on defense, or wishy-washy language on security commitments. So certainly I think it's about sending the assurance that the alliance is solid, and that actually I don't think that you want to be front and center when Trump is thinking about what he wants to do with his trade policy. So finding the common areas and trying to be a bit below radar, I think would be good given all the turmoil that we're seeing today.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot about laying low, letting him focus on other countries, right, et cetera. Okay, with that, please join me in thanking this excellent panel. Thank you for joining us this evening.